And we are reserving the microphone for the presenters, so we invite you to just collaborate with your colleagues and with the presenters, post any questions in the chat box. We do get a transcript of the chat, so if we're not able to get back to you during the session, we'll follow up later on. We have your email information. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow or early next week, and we'll give you links and some of the materials that we are highlighting tonight. So that follow-up email will come to all who registered, and it will have the recording link also in it. And we invite you to pass that along to your colleagues. People, of course, don't need to have registered in order to watch the recording. The session is sponsored by WGBH, which is Boston's public media station and a major content producer of programs that you see on your local public media stations around the country. And also PBS LearningMedia, which is a partnership between WGBH and PBS, and it is a vast supplemental curriculum service offering short clips, interactives, lesson plans, thousands of resources, and everything is free. And I'm always curious about who has heard of PBS LearningMedia before, and if you have, what you particularly like about it. So if you are already a PBS LearningMedia user and you let me know, that would be great in the chat box. Thank you. We are joined tonight by Rachel Conley, who's Director of STEM Education here at WGBH, Laura Johnson, who is responsible for a lot of what you're going to see tonight, Senior Manager of Learning Experience Design. And our featured presenter is Maya Lin, artist and architect, and the founder of the What is Missing project. And Rachel will be introducing Maya in a little bit. We also are thrilled to have two teachers, one from Maine and one from Oklahoma. Michelle Benoit is a high school science teacher in Bangor, Maine at Bangor High School. And Ginger is a middle and high school science teacher. She teaches about everything you can imagine related to science in a relatively small school in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Rachel Conley, who will get us started talking about the project and then introducing Maya. Rachel?
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm going to switch over now and share my screen so everybody can see it. And I'll echo Carolyn and say thank you again for your evening, spending your evening with us. And I'll jump right in by saying that, you know, Maya Lin is no less than one of the most important public artists of our time. And when the opportunity to work with her arose, I was at first both exhilarated and terrified at the same time. As a science educator, what first came to mind for me were her architectural works and memorials like the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that made her an international celebrity when she was still a senior at Yale in the School of Architecture. But then I got to visit her in her studio in New York City and first encountered some of her amazing large-scale environmental work. For example, the three-part sculpture Around the World that you see on the left here shows what is underneath the surface of the ocean if you took the water away. It's like a topographical map cut out of marble. And in the picture on the right, you can see two more installations. Waterline, the one above, is a wireframe three-dimensional drawing in space made with aluminum tubes. And it's based on a particular undersea formation in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And Blue Lake Pass below is a topographic translation of a Colorado mountain range made of layers of stacked particle board. In all of these, you can see the interplay between the handmade and the computer data sets. And that was when I realized that Maya's vision and work really embodies STEAM, the exemplar of the integration of STEM and the arts. She can distill complex data and information about our planet into incredibly beautiful and minimalist forms, like the pin rivers that you see her putting together right here. Maya began planning the Missing project that we're going to hear about briefly, or right after I get done here, more than 20 years ago, and she was calling it her last memorial. So we at WGBH really saw the value in using art to explore and understand the planet and these issues. And we wanted to help teachers and students do this. But first, we really needed to explore the instructional value of this experience. And we took a deep look at the next generation science standards and other instructional design resources and saw these timelines that you're going to hear about shortly for what they really could be, models of species populations that can provide students with evidence about factors that affect biodiversity. The standards even call ecosystem dynamics complex, as you can see here in this statement from an NGS DCI, or disciplinary core idea. But telling stories through the lens of one species can really focus and scaffold students into these larger, more complicated stories. And it gives students some agency to identify a species to focus on their own that can give them even more motivation and feeling of investment. It's also about exploring different kinds of data. The idea of what data for biodiversity looks like is really surprising when you start to look at some of the different sources, from personal accounts to population graphs, that can be used. Multiple analysis approaches that we offer in the teacher guide that Laura's going to share with you also really help students' timelines become the beginning of something, not just sort of an end product that they make. Our process has been one that has been really deeply integrated from the beginning with teachers, such as the two you're going to hear from tonight. And we're really proud tonight to be able to launch the Building a Biodiversity Timeline resource on PBS LearningMedia, and to have Maya Lin join us tonight. So without further ado, she's been the subject of solo exhibitions at museums worldwide and has created permanent outdoor installations for public and private collections from New York to New Zealand. And here to share with us tonight her final memorial, What is Missing, is Maya Lin. Maya?
Hi, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Carolyn. I'm so proud to be a part of this. We couldn't be more excited. Chandel, my assistant, who's been assisting me with What is Missing, and we're going to pop up and just give you a brief overview of what is missing and then focus in on what is part of the Biodiversity Timeline project. So I'm just going to head on into it and say, as Rachel mentioned, I started this 20 years ago, and it's not so much, this is just an overview, the species that have gone extinct, the species that will go extinct in our lifetime, the species that we will never know because we destroyed their habitats before we ever knew them. And it posed a question to me, what if we could make a memorial, I call this my last memorial, that could jump form and content. So whether it's permanent pieces, temporary exhibits, taking over the Times Square billboard for the month of April, or this is the empty room, you get to hold a species in your hand, or Creative Time got us the MTV billboard in New York Times Times Square for the month of April in 2010. What I'm trying to do is connect species loss to habitat loss, because of course it's not just the species that are threatened right now, it's the habitats they need. And as an artist, I tend to like to get you to be aware of things that you might not even realize are disappearing. So for me, just realizing that the sounds of once common songbirds has completely changed since when I was a kid, that Audubon says, you know, songbirds are in a 50 to 70% decline. So literally the landscapes we all grew up with as kids has changed significantly as far as sounds. So things like the size of a cod, was the size of a man in 1895, but today it's been fished out. Why? It's not so much to get you to be depressed because we link to hope and action, but literally landscape amnesia. How can we protect it if we don't even remember that it was missing? So using time to teach us about what the past has been hopefully can guide us to a different future. But also it's about getting kids especially to be amazed that lobsters were 6 feet long, according to Adrian Vanderdonk, when settlers first sailed into the harbor. And so part of what is missing is based online, whatismissing.org, and on it there's a map of stories of the past, what we've lost, of the present, conservation stories, and we're working on the future, which is something called Greenprint. But what we're here tonight to talk about is the map of memory and the map of conservation. So it's timelines, and all the toggles on the What is Missing website are found on the bottom end of the website. Timelines, videos, stories, conservation stories, disasters. And we see this really as an ecological history of the planet that is a teaching tool. You can view those stories geolocated, or you can click the button up here, View in Time, and it'll tell you those stories along a timeline. So we're hoping there's a wonderful link and kids will get interested through their classes to explore different histories. And the quotes, we've got thousands and thousands from Plato to Julius Caesar, as well as personal memories, that anyone can add a memory. So getting to where we are today, and we're so excited to be linked with WGBH, and we thank all the teachers that have joined today, that literally how do we use history, how do we use an awareness about a specific species to talk about the ecology of the planet in a way, and also fascinate you with really great stories about what once was. And generally with most of these stories there's loss, and then there's an awareness and conservation, and then species, a lot of them are very resilient and come back. So hope is so much a part of this. We've also done timelines of cities as well as species. And so this gives you an idea of what is available for kids to look at as they're building their own biodiversity timeline, because often what our message is, once you start conserving it, nature is intensely resilient and generally comes back. So we're so happy to be here and looking forward to everyone talking about what we're doing, but the timelines get to create and build their own timelines of a species and really learn through research how a species has changed over time and people's reactions and actions and how conservation measures really can affect change. We've suggested that basically every timeline has an overview that really gives you kind of an overview before you even get started, because sometimes when you launch right into finding the earliest accounts, it's harder than if you have kind of a way of looking at, okay, what has happened over time? So that's a great way to get students started. And, you know, this is one in particular, like this is the overview of the tiger. We also link to groups that are like what they're doing, because I think kids will want to get more involved and maybe want to know what's going on in the conservation world, and down to when you can find numbers. In some species it's almost impossible, but the research involved to find biodiversity is hugely important, but as well as just letting them learn how to research an animal from early historic accounts to the present day. And this is an alligator. An alligator is one of those great recovery stories where it's rebounded so well. And so right now, and I'm going to end with just the amount of research, students will need to gather historical and current observations about their chosen topic and really give you a depth and breadth of what a species has gone through. Image selection, again, we've got guidelines because especially if we post it on our website, we like knowing it's rights-free. There are amazing sources out there from the Library of Congress, the Digital Public Library, local historical societies, and it's just a wealth of images and information out there that we've had a lot of fun looking through to find and build our timelines. And I think what is so valuable, and I would love to encourage students to, as they're building their own biodiversity timeline in class, to talk to their parents, interview their grandparents, to begin to maybe contribute stories online to what is missing. Because again, making something personally relevant to your own backyard gets people very connected to nature in a way that I find kind of invaluable. And again, learning through this, what's going on in your own backyard for conservation is also very helpful. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to the team. Oh, so we're going to get back. There we go.
Thank you, Maya. This is Carolyn, and we're going to be hearing from Laura next. For those of you who have questions for Maya, she's going to remain in the session, so please post them in the chat box, and we'll keep monitoring that. There's a lot of excitement, Maya, about the project.
Well, we couldn't be more excited to be a part of this.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to hear from Laura.
Hi, everyone. So as Rachel mentioned earlier, the resources that we've developed as part of this project consist of an interactive lesson, which you're looking at page 1 of on the screen, and that's for students to move through. And then we've also developed a teacher's guide, which outlines a corresponding interdisciplinary research activity that students can engage with after they've kind of explored issues of biodiversity through this interactive lesson. The focus of the student-facing materials and the research activity is on identifying and evaluating solutions for reducing human impacts on the environment and biodiversity. So really closely linked with everything that What is Missing is about and the timelines that are on that site. So as students move through this interactive lesson, there are 13 screens, and they will find videos, images, text, and interactive elements that will ask them to answer questions, provide their thoughts, document their observations as they're moving through this experience. When we were designing this, the purpose of the varied components of the lesson was to engage students in the topic of biodiversity and the story of the bald eagle, which we'll move into next, and get them thinking critically about how timelines can be used to analyze trends and patterns and support effective arguments about how and why things happened when it comes to species loss, biodiversity loss, and eventually conservation efforts. So as Maya was just talking about with the example of the tiger and the alligator, we chose to use the timeline of the bald eagle for the example to walk students through. And this comes directly from the What is Missing site, the images, the quotes, the titles. And we chose this as kind of an exemplar species because the bald eagle has had a population size which has fluctuated throughout history, unfortunately due to human impacts. And through the entries in this timeline, students will be able to examine the stability of the bald eagle population and evaluate various solutions that impacted that population. And there are several different entries in the timeline that take students through the story of the bald eagle from when it had huge populations before humans really had anything to do with it, how that population size declined once humans started hunting them and poisoning them with DDT, and then how solutions were put in place through legislation that eventually made the bald eagles make a fantastic recovery, and it's kind of a poster child species for efforts of conservation. Additionally, as students move through this interactive lesson, they're going to encounter timeline tips that are going to set them up for the research activity that they'll engage in after this interactive lesson. The tips are on how to engage in research, image selection, credible resources, and a lot of other things that Maya touched on as things that they're looking for if students eventually want to contribute their timelines to what is missing. At the end of the interactive lesson, we ask students to kind of reflect on the experience that they just went through and observed. By engaging with the example timeline and the analysis in this interactive lesson, students will learn how various kinds of data and information can be gathered to create a biodiversity timeline that eventually serves as evidence of and provides insights into changes in a population of a species. This experience will lay the foundation for the creation of their own timelines, which is outlined in the teacher's guide, which I'll move into next here. Let's see, switch screen. Okay, so here, and all of this, and I've seen some questions in the chat box about what actually what does the resource consist of. So the resource consists of the interactive lesson, which students can access on their own, a teacher's guide, which outlines kind of what's inside the interactive lesson, how to walk students through that, and then what to do afterwards with this really engaging research activity that can take many different forms, and we've outlined a bunch of options in the teacher's guide. Additionally, we have 3 example timelines coming right from what is missing that students can investigate and look at the formatting of, the types of sources that are used, the types of observations that are cited, and get them thinking about what types of things they want to include in their own timeline. Additionally, there will be a handout helping students conduct interviews with people in their local community, whether it's a librarian, a local conservation expert, a professor at a university, or their grandparent or parent. They need to really think about how to get the information they need that will support the conclusions that they're going to come to and what evidence they need to gather to make claims that will really help them analyze the timelines that they create. The last piece that we offer is the opportunity, if desired, to submit timelines to the What is Missing site, and we've outlined the process that you can go through and your students can go through if that's something that you want to do as an extension once the timelines are complete. So in this research activity, students create a timeline that will serve as a tool for exploring biodiversity through the lens of a single species. As I mentioned, they'll have the timelines from What is Missing to refer to as exemplars, and they'll have support throughout the research process in the forms of handouts and interview guides. They'll select a plant or an animal with a history of population shifts and gather evidence regarding the changes using historical accounts, research materials, and first-person interviews. They'll then build a timeline and analyze the data, ultimately communicating the history of their selected species. We've built in a great deal of flexibility in the teacher's guide to support a wide range of implementation strategies. And our goal here was really to engage students around stories of biodiversity from their backyard to across the globe. And we're excited to hear how you're thinking of using these these resources in your own classroom. And hopefully we can open it up to chat conversation once we hear from Ginger and Michelle about how they're thinking of using and have used these resources already. So by investigating these issues through an authentic research process, students will gain a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of humans and the environment and the impact human activities can have on biodiversity. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what we've produced for students and educators on PBS LearningMedia through this amazing partnership with Maya Lin and What is Missing. And I'll now turn it over to Michelle to hear her thoughts on how these resources fit into her classroom.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank WGBH for inviting me to share my thoughts on this, and also to Maya Lin for creating such a wonderful project as part of the focus group back in June. I was just really blown away by the website, and I feel like I look at the landscape very differently than I did before. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my school and myself, and then spend most of the time discussing how I would see myself integrating this interactive lesson into my classes. Bangor High is one of the largest public high schools in Maine with over 1,000 students. I consider it to be an urban school with a rural influence. We're a city of about 33,000 people, but we draw from schools outside of that have definitely a more rural character. Bangor also is a service center, and that was reflected in the student population. We also have a number of at-risk students. A unique feature of Bangor High is our STEM Academy. It's something that was launched about 5 years ago as a school within a school. It's a program designed for students with a high interest in science. They begin as freshmen. There are several required courses that they take in research and engineering, and then they get to sample all the other math and science courses the school has to offer. One of its strengths is that it engages students in real research after their freshman year. They're working with professors at the University of Maine, which is just up the road from us, in the lab, working with undergraduates, graduates, professors, on everything from water quality to designing remote sensors. As for me, I've been teaching more than 25 years in Maine public schools. I have an integrated background of English and science. I'm currently teaching chemistry, both college prep and an introductory chemistry, which is a course that targets our at-risk students, both academically at risk and socioeconomically at risk. One of the things I do try to do is find ways to put art into our STEM to make STEAM. So one of my favorite examples was I was able to work with a choreographer in residence to create a dance about water. So we're talking about biodiversity tonight, and you may be wondering, what's the chemistry teacher doing in a bio class? Maine's natural environment is very important to its economy and to its cultural heritage. So I try to emphasize environmental chemistry in my classes. So as I was going through this interactive lesson, I was looking for ways to make a connection between the biodiversity and chemistry content. One of the things that caught my eye was looking at the DDT piece, having students focus on the molecular structure, trying to understand how that works, maybe what class of compounds it was in, and even some of the biochemical effects of that chemical on natural systems. The other one that caught my eye was looking at lead, again, looking at its effect as a heavy metal. Again, how does it bioaccumulate in the system? How does it affect neurological systems in the body? The bald eagle in Maine is a success story. It's had an amazing comeback. We actually see bald eagles in downtown Bangor, which can be a little disconcerting if you're driving down the road. But they are regular features on our landscape. And I thought I could make a local connection for students about how is lead in the environment currently affecting Maine bald eagles. Students are familiar with the eagles. There would be a high interest. We had a story a few years ago where a pair of parents of nesting eagles was, they were ingested toxins along with lead and had to be rescued. Their eaglets were still in the nest, and there's rather dramatic rescue of those eaglets as well. The students would be familiar with this, and I think it would generate a lot of interest for them to investigate this question. So I would like to pick up, have my students pick up in some ways where the timeline left off with the concerns about lead in the environment. And I think there would be an abundant opportunity for research with local agencies, whether it's our State Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Department or State Department of Environmental Protection, or the group that rehabs these birds that come in with toxins, a group called Avian Haven. They have records of all of the birds that are brought to them, the levels of lead, the recovery rates, and so they'd have a historical record over the last probably 15 or 20 years about whether this incidence of lead poisoning in the bald eagle is increasing or decreasing. As I was going through the interactive lesson, I was looking for how the skills required aligned with what I was doing in the classroom and how it extended them as well. So the first slide that I have here is from page 4 of the interactive lesson. And something I really liked about this, and I think the strength of this lesson, is the emphasis on evidence. So there is the requirement of gathering information and data to build a case. And this aligns beautifully with what I do in my classroom in terms of claim, evidence, and reasoning. When students make a claim, they have to use evidence to support their claim, and then use their reasoning to link the evidence and the claim to come to some conclusion, or perhaps in this case to offer some solution. I also liked very much the variety of sources that students are encouraged to use, whether it's written evidence, primary sources, popular sources, the visual representation of a particular time period. I just thought that having this variety of kinds of evidence would appeal to a wide range of students, maybe students who don't always think of themselves as science kids, so maybe it will appeal to the historian, to the artist, the journalist, and the scientist. So
Michelle, excuse me,
yes.
it's Carolyn. I just am going
Yes.
to ask you to speak up a little bit louder
Okay,
so we
thank you.
make sure that the recording is strong. Thank you.
Okay, is that better?
Oh, yeah, baby. That's good.
Okay, I'll get the piece of voice on. All right.
Now we're
So,
talking.
all right, thank you. Another piece I like, and something I try to emphasize with my students, is looking at the quality of their sources. And this was a timeline tip that was on page 7 of the interactive lesson. And it just felt like such a important reminder, especially when we're using so many digital resources that don't go through the same vetting process as printed sources, that can change so quickly. And it seems also like a very timely reminder as we're seeing the rise of the so-called fake news, and even an increase of satirical sites. I know my students have a hard time realizing that things on the Onion are satire and not an actual news story. So on a lot of levels, I see this tip on identifying and checking out your sources as a way to, a reminder we all need, but also increases student awareness and lets them practice kind of critical thinking skills as they, judge whether this source is credible, how could they use it, how does it fit into, what they're researching. And then the last slide is the one that we saw earlier on analyzing the bald eagle timeline. I kind of find when I'm doing research, and I think students have this experience too, when you're in the middle of researching, it's really easy to get caught up in the details of what you're doing and all the pieces, and not necessarily step back to see the whole. So I like that this lesson asks students directly to put the pieces together and move to a big picture view. They're using the timely entries as evidence, asking them to explain the story of the bald eagle. So it's again kind of coming back to that claim, evidence, reasoning practice, again asking them to use higher order thinking skills. So they're not only explaining what happened, but why. And I think that also allows students to really bring together the interdisciplinary nature of this approach. They have to integrate the science portion maybe look at shifting understanding of the natural environment, shifting fields in politics, and then the role of different kinds of groups and individuals as well as the scientists. So as I look at, I've tried to think about how I would implement this in my classroom. And I think for me, what would work best with my students would be to have them in small groups as they did this lesson. I think I tried to blend student interest and talents within the group. For my introductory class, I would do this more as an in-class assignment, maybe more guided inquiry. And for my college prep students, I would see having them do more outside research and then bringing it back to the group for some in-class time. And I also began thinking about, well, all right, beyond the bald eagle, what can my students look at? I could see them applying similar techniques to other local concerns. The Penobscot River is a major river that runs through Bangor. It's a sacred river to the Penobscot people in Maine. At the height of the logging industry, there were numerous log drives down the river, which obviously would have an effect on the river ecosystem and the biota in the river. And then later on, there were concerns about mercury in the river. So I think that students could use this technique of creating a timeline with supporting images, with supporting written text to examine a question like that. Again, a very local piece that students would be familiar with. They know the river very well, but give it a different depth and perspective that they may not have had before. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, or if you have any reactions to this approach. If you put those in the timeline, the chat box, I'll answer those. So thank you for listening, and I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, Ginger.
Thanks, Michelle. You did an awesome job. So hi guys, I am coming at this from an environmental sciences perspective. My name is Ginger Hendricks, and I am the middle school, high school science teacher for Maine Lutheran Christian Academy. Thank you, Carolyn. A small private school in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I've been teaching for over 20 years, and several years ago I accepted the science position at Emmanuel and have loved every minute of it since. We have approximately 150 students at our school, of which I see about 70 on a daily basis. So I teach a variety of science courses, including 6th and 7th grade science, 8th grade physical science, 9th grade biology, and then I rotate between environmental science, chemistry, anatomy, and physiology at the high school level. And next year, we're going to add at least another course. So wish me luck. I was very excited when I was asked to join a pilot group for PBS LearningMedia back in June of last year, introducing Maya Lin's What is Missing project. And since then, I've been brainstorming the best way to use her material in my classroom. And recently, Carolyn contacted me and asked me to review the interactive lesson you're seeing tonight. And as it fit right in with our current chapter on conservation and biodiversity, I decided to pilot it last week in my environmental sciences class and get their feedback, and I'll be sharing this with you as well. I like how the interactive lesson lends itself to all student levels, as well as the fact that you can tailor that material to your class's learning style, as you can see in the educator's guide.
It's a big moment for a young bald eagle to bag his first
coop. In this day and age can be a really difficult thing to do, to say the least. I'm going to share with you something that we found really interesting.
The bald eagle's a survivor.
It's a brief clip which, when you're looking at the lesson,
really bad times,
it's located
and
on
now it's
screen
prevailing.
4.
Is an illustration that we can make a difference, and we can be stewards of this planet.
What you're going to see in a minute is the behavior of the young bald eagles as they learn to fend for themselves, and we had a lot of discussion about that.
With food so plentiful, bald eagles, young and old, switch from hunting to something more like rugby.
And what is going to happen in a little bit is they're going to actually be passing the fish from bird to bird to bird. And my students just went crazy when they saw that. And so we had to research afterwards and look all these behaviors up and discuss them, which was actually really cool. So it's coming up right about here.
That's
and it's just amazing.
Oh my God.
So I'm going to stop it about right there and head on back to my slides. But as you can see, that was really a neat thing to watch. And so after we viewed this clip, we probably spent a good 20 minutes on what they had seen. And these are my students who don't really enjoy science. So it was awesome to see them so animated. It was a neat thing to see in the classroom. So another thing I'd like to share is that all of my students in this particular class, they're made up of 10th through 12th graders, with the majority of the class being seniors. They made the recommendation that I present this material at the beginning of my unit next year rather than at the end, which I did this time. They said it definitely would have given them a better perspective about the content to follow. And so I'm going to follow their recommendation with next year's class. Give me just a second. So I love the hands-on learning approach this interactive lesson offers itself to, as my students can take what they've learned in the classroom with this material. They can apply it to a real-life scenario and make a difference in their community all at the same time, which is a really important point with me. And I'm going to give you an example of what I'm doing in my classroom right now. So after we wrap up the chapter this week, my class is going to research trees native to Oklahoma, specifically the Tulsa area, going through the lesson plan that you see here, and we're going to conclude with a tree planting project with our local nonprofit group Uplift Trees. I picked native trees as our research focus because Tulsa recently lost over 3,000 trees from what I understand to disease, and Uplift Trees is trying to introduce trees which are hardier and they can better withstand our challenging disease agents and environmental conditions like our really, really hot summers. And I was telling Carolyn as we were logging on, it was 86 driving home today, and that's just amazing for February. And then tomorrow it's supposed to be 51. So there are several ways you can present this interactive lesson in your classroom setting, and I'd love to get your ideas as well. For example, my current class, that I told you of 10th through 12th graders, they consist of on to below level students. So what I'm going to do next week is to divide them in 3 groups, as you see right here on the slide. One group is going to research Tulsa tree history, another is going to research current condition, and that last group is going to focus on conservation and biodiversity with the trees. Then what we're going to do as a class is we're going to gather all the material together into one cohesive paper, and we're going to plant trees with Uplift Trees on Thursday, March 9th. I just solidified that date right before spring break, so I'm really excited about that. So speaking of teaching tips, I very much appreciate that this lesson offers tips. They're located at the bottom of the slides, like the one you see here, and they're a great visual reminder for students, especially struggling students, of what they need to consider as they research and present the material to their instructor. Now next year, I'm going to do something a little different, as that upcoming group are AP capable. So each of them are going to, for their midterm, research an organism of their choice, follow the steps to Maya Lin's timeline, and then we're going to choose the one that best fits her material to submit, and hopefully will be added to that awesome list of species currently pictured in front of you. So as I wrap up my part here, I just wanted to say thank you to Maya Lin, along with the PBS LearningMedia team, for allowing me this opportunity and this resource in my classroom. If anyone has any questions, I'll be watching the chat box. What ideas or what are your thoughts about local projects in your area, and how could you best fit this lesson into your curriculum? So please feel free to visit with me as well. And thank you so much.
And thank you, Ginger. Wow. My head is spinning, and there's been a lot of activity in the chat box. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is so delightful. And so I want to give Maya or Rachel another opportunity to ask the group a question or two or make some more comments. If either of you would like to speak, you have an opportunity to do so.
Well, I mean, thank you. I thought both Michelle and Ginger, what you've added to the possibilities, I couldn't be more excited by, because in a way, you know, I always thought, like, if you stood in your own hometown and you just wondered, what was this place like 1,000 years ago? What was this place like 100 years ago? And what is it like today? And I think it almost connects the students in a very personal way. And I think I love the Eagle one as well. So I've always been torn, like, whether it's the species timelines, which I think are great ways to focus and teach science, and yet that personal connection to your own hometown and interviewing your parents and your grandparents is something that kids of this age group, I hope they really get excited and relate to. Maybe for me it was always about how do we make kind of awareness about the environment not just be something distant, but something personally connected to you. And so I couldn't be more excited than by both Ginger's focus on trees in Tulsa. I mean, I would love it if we could pop just personal stories and memories and a little bit about Tulsa, put Tulsa on the map, put Bangor on the map, you know, because I think those are things that I can't access whatsoever, and it would just be an absolute joy and privilege to have students working and interviewing their parents and their grandparents and literally allowing missing to go back in time. So I couldn't be more excited by how different teachers and will guide their students in, and it'll be very interesting to see how students react and what their interests are, where they want to take it a little bit.
Thank you, Maya. This is Rachel. I just wanted to follow up on that and say that we find that the extension and submission of student timelines to what is missing is an important option and consideration for teachers, and you will find a handout dedicated to what that submission process is in the resource on PBS LearningMedia in the supporting materials. So with the teacher guide, there is also a handout dedicated to that submission process that Maya's referencing.
Right, and I think one of the things is I love the video of the Eagles, but again, we always are extremely careful of to what we can post so that we don't have to be running around worrying about rights, because you have to be very, very careful. I think in a way that's why there's a big guide on image-based linking historic accounts to images. I think it's also wonderful because as I typed it in, you can really get pretty close. Like if you're going for photographs, that's going to correlate to when photography got invented, and you try to get it close. You try to work with you know, art history images that are relevant to the time period, unless, of course, you've gone way back in time and you're dealing with photographs of the Lascaux Caves or something like that. But as far as we have to be careful, I think the other thing is there's a process for adding both personal memories that's all about getting permission, so that what makes any personal memory great is if you can give permission to use like a family photo. Like we've got these great images of kids fishing at home when they were little. Oftentimes if someone doesn't have an image, because sometimes it's hard, we will personally find something that correlates with it, because it's always nicer for especially kids to look at and relate to a memory if there's an image to it. I think it's very easy. Anyone can kind of add a memory on the personal end. That's already set up. Though we do check it, screen it, so when someone says, well, I'm missing my dog, those don't make it. But if it deals with biodiversity changes and shifts, we're absolutely putting that on. Timelines, again, have been something where it's a much more collaborative partnered situation, so that your school, your class would work with my assistant, Chandel, to see what goes on. And again, we just have to be careful with rights of what we post so that you've done the due diligence. And again, it's going to get interesting, like how many bald eagle timelines can we have, whereas putting Tulsa on the map is going to be incredible. So we have to kind of work that out between us, what that could be, especially if there's an existing timeline of that species, and let's say students around the country are building on the same species, so we have to figure that one out a little bit to see how best to do that. Part of me says we could create timelines within the sort of the personal memory one, which is much more kind of built by the students, so we can have different timelines of different species coming out of different, more localized regional areas, whereas the other timelines are much more like we're trying to get global number assessments of tigers or lions or things like that. But that's all something we could work out.
Great, thank you both. All right, we are winding down, and if people have other comments or questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box now. On the screen is my contact information, and you are welcome to email me any questions about the project or about WGBH or PBS LearningMedia. I know that some of you are already familiar with PBS LearningMedia, and if you haven't already, please visit the site. Registration is free, and we encourage you to certainly explore the Biodiversity Timeline Interactive that's been the subject of tonight's session, and also the thousands of other resources that are on the site. So I'm going to say a huge thank you again to Rachel and Laura and Maya Lin, and also to Ginger and Michelle.